In this video module, we're going to think more about what is pharmacy. And in our last video, we kind of defined what it means to be a professional, and we thought about that in this heuristic of social utility and social sanction and social responsibility. And let's think about, what that might mean for pharmacy. Certainly, we know that we use medications in the United States, probably the most common form of medical treatment. We'll use about 4 billion prescriptions a year. And let me share some statistics with you from the National Center for Health Statistics. Nearly half of all Americans, 48.3%, have used at least one prescription medication in the past month. Nearly a third, 31.2%, have used 2 or more. And over 10%, or 10.7%, have used 5 or more. So in terms of social utility, obviously we use medications a lot in the United States, probably more than any other country in the world. It's an important part of our healthcare system. We know that these medications can help us. Obviously that's why we're using them. But we also know that medications have adverse drug events or side effects and other kinds of reactions that can be harmful. So if they're not used properly, they can certainly hurt us as well as help us. So the social utility involved here is that we know we use these medications a lot. We know if they're used properly that they can help us. If they're not used properly, they can hurt us. So that the pharmacist's role in what we will call medication therapy management, and we'll use that term a lot throughout this course, is certainly a very valuable piece of social utility. If we think about social sanction, obviously pharmacists get a license, and we'll understand more about what that means later in the course. We also have a certain amount of autonomy in the way we practice, and we receive a fair amount of benefits and prestige from this profession that we've entered. And then finally, as I said to you in the last video, we're going to spend most of this course thinking about the responsibilities that pharmacists have based on the social utility they provide and the social sanction they've been granted. So they meet that third tenet as well. So we probably would all agree that pharmacy is certainly a profession. But let's kind of flesh out more what that profession really is and what it means. So I'd like to start off by defining this word pharmacy, and I want to use the 2 roots that the best we can understand kind of apply to this word pharmacy. The first is Latin, or pharmacia, and the second and third are from the Greek, pharmakai or pharmakon. These words provide an etymology for the word pharmacy, but they also can refer to the use of medications and how they're prepared. Certainly they can be referred to as poisons or sorcery or even magical charms. I find that these definitions are all applicable because as we think about these medications, they can do good, but they can do bad. So they can be helpful, they can be poison. So all these things around this meaning of this word come to bear. Let's think about what Webster's Dictionary has to say to us in terms of what pharmacy is. Here's a definition from Webster's. It says, pharmacy is the art, practice, or profession of preparing, preserving, compounding, and dispensing medical drugs. And we see here remind you again that our green fonts are our pharmacy fundamentals, and we'll define those kind of key phrases that I want you to learn at the end of this module. This definition of pharmacy, quite frankly, I think is pretty narrow, and I'm hoping that as we progress through this course that you'll have a much stronger understanding of why I just said that. So what is it? What else do pharmacists do, and how is that changing? And I'm going to ask you as an assignment even this week to write a definition of pharmacy maybe that you can embellish on Webster's has written. But also at the end of the course, I'm going to ask you to think about it again because I'm hoping that you have a much better understanding of why this really is a pretty limited definition. Well, I want to think about this profession of pharmacy with you. I want to think about some historical trends kind of at the 30,000 foot view, if you will, in terms of what this thing looks like. These trends that I'm about to lay out in front of you now, we're going to see vestiges of them throughout this course. We're going to see them in kind of the brief history that we will learn even yet this week. We're going to see it in the curriculum. We're going to see it in career opportunities for pharmacists. We're going to see it in regulations and all the things that we're going to be studying. So let's kind of think about kind of in the kind of near past history, what is it that has happened to this profession? And I want to think about this in terms of trends. So first of all, we think about what pharmacists do. And certainly in early America and even before the beginnings of pharmacy in our country, we can think about the progression from pharmacists being what I'll classify as a craftsman, where they really made medications from raw materials and took barks and roots and things like that, leaves and natural resources typically, and actually prepared the chemicals that we use to treat disease. That progressed toward the end of the 19th century to being more of a compounder, and really during the 20th century really became to fruition, meaning that we were now using chemicals typically that were made by manufacturers and using those chemicals to compound the medications that we needed. That, during the 20th century, progressed into us being dispensers, really, of medications where, pharmaceutical companies took over that process of not only preparing the chemicals, but also preparing the medications, largely. So, we became just dispensers of medications that were really prepared by industry. Certainly, compounding has maintained a presence in this profession, and it does today. But certainly a very small percentage of the medications that pharmacists dispense in the 21st century do they have to really compound or make. And then finally, as we look toward the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, we started to move into more of patient-centered care providers. We're going to talk about terms like pharmaceutical care and medication therapy management, and we're going to hear pharmacists from different backgrounds that tell us how they're using those practices to help get better outcomes in patients. So it's moving beyond compounding medications and even dispensing medications to helping patients use them properly. Even where pharmacists work has kind of dramatically changed. And if we think about community practice, for example, in the early days in America and in the early parts of the 20th century especially, pharmacists typically owned their shops. They were independent pharmacists, and they had businesses that they owned and managed. Throughout the 20th century, that transitioned into most pharmacists working as employees, perhaps in community pharmacies in the chain industry. So we have chain pharmacies like Walgreens or CVS or Rite Aid and many others that you're familiar with, where pharmacists don't typically own those pharmacies, but they work in them and they are employees. I want to say this, that certainly independent pharmacy ownership is alive and well, and I believe personally that with the things we're going to think about in this course, about what pharmacists can do in terms of patient-centered service, I think there's room for entrepreneurial growth and how we can develop independent pharmacy ownerships around a service model instead of a dispensing model. And if we think about hospital practices, and we're going to meet several hospital practitioners throughout the course, and really my background was early in my career really in hospital practice, but we moved in that environment from being more providing what I would call order fulfillment, really dispensing medications, to more of a collaborative practice model. So yes, we've got to get the right drug to the right patient at the right time, and that order fulfillment and dispensing process has got to be solid. But what we've done throughout the 20th century and into the 21st is really become more involved in a collaborative practice model with other healthcare providers around, are we choosing the right drugs, are we monitoring them properly, and are we getting the kinds of outcomes that we expected? And we're going to learn throughout this course, I've mentioned community practice and hospital practice to you in the last few minutes. There are myriad other settings where pharmacists practice, and they practice many of these same things we just talked about. We're going to learn about many of them as we progress through the next 7 weeks. And if we think about trends in healthcare, maybe even more broadly, I'd like to think about it this way with you. We've moved really early in our history to using what you might call intuitive medicine or symptomatic medicine. Maybe that means using what seems to be the best knowledge at the time and what we think about physiology and pharmacology, all the things we'll think about later in the course, and making the best guess on what the right treatments would be. We've moved from intuitive medicine to what I will call empirical medicine, and here's a pharmacy fundamental for you. You might also think of this as evidence-based medicine, meaning do we really have solid scientific research that tells us that this drug works for what we think we're going to be trying to treat. So moving from intuitive medicine to what we think will work, to empirical medicine to something we know will work. And then finally, we're moving into what I will call precision medicine or personalized medicine, another pharmacy fundamental, meaning how can I individualize this therapy for my patient or for me based on my genetic information and other information I have about the patient, how can I individualize this and personalize this medication therapy instead of having a one-size-fits-all mentality? And then really, I think if we think about this more broadly even, pharmacy over this time and all these trends that I've mentioned to you has basically moving from a product orientation more to a patient orientation. So, the product is so important. We've got to be able to make it right. We've got to be able to dispense it right. If we don't get the right drugs, it's not going to work. But it's moving much more toward the patients. Is the patient getting the right care? Do they understand how to take the drugs? Are we monitoring it properly? Are we following outcomes and all those things that we'll talk about this during the course? I want to conclude this module with a discussion of a quote from Wendell Hill, who was the former dean at the College of Pharmacy at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Wendell said that what we as pharmacists believe our profession to be determines what it is, no more or no less. So, there's a sea change happening in this profession. You're going to learn about it more over these next 7 weeks, that what pharmacists do is changing, what we need to do is changing. It's based around what the patient needs. We had a hooding ceremony speaker here in 2003. His name was Henry Manasseh. He was at the time the CEO of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, a group that you'll learn about during the course. And during his hooding ceremony speech here on our campus, he said that the tide is rising. You're either going to surf it or you're going to swallow it. It's a sea change. Things are shifting, and pharmacists are learning to kind of adopt to that shifting need. Here are our pharmacy fundamentals that we've talked about. First, compounding, which means the preparation and mixing of various ingredients to make a dosage form of a drug in accordance with a prescription. One of the things that you may know is that the whole idea of compounding pharmacies is a very controversial topic right now. And that, what is compounding and what is manufacturing has become a kind of a critical question in our healthcare system. Secondly, dispensing means reviewing, record keeping, drug product preparation and labeling, checking, and patient counseling when distributing prescription medications. And let me just kind of also define this word counseling. When pharmacists talk about counseling, they mean really educating a patient about how to use their medications, what side effects to look for, what we should be monitoring. When do you call your healthcare providers if you have a certain kind of a problem? That's really counseling, and dispensing encompasses that as well as getting the drug to the patient, the right drug to the right patient at the right time. We talked about evidence-based medicine, the use of therapies proven to be effective through sound research to guide treatment of patients. And then we talked about personalized medicine, the individualization of a patient's therapy based on his or her unique characteristics using genetic and other available information. And here's the question, another question I'd like you to think about this week as we go into discussion forums. What would you add to the Webster's Dictionary definition of pharmacy? And I'll ask you to do that as well during an assignment for this week. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.